Today, I'm going to tell you a story that will leave you speechless. Imagine this. You're simply driving home after a long day at work, minding your own business, when a routine traffic stop turns into a nightmare. But it's not just any stop. This one ends with an officer crossing a line that he never saw coming. What happens next will make you question everything you know about justice and accountability. What if you were unjustly treated, humiliated, and even assaulted, all for something as small as a traffic mistake? But here's the twist. The woman this officer thought he could control wasn't just any ordinary citizen. She was someone whose career could turn his entire world upside down. Stay tuned to see how this shocking encounter unfolds and how the very system that was meant to protect her was about to be turned on its head. If you have a similar story or if you've ever been unjustly treated, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share your experience. Let's talk about the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter the circumstances. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next incredible story. It was a quiet evening in the small town of Maplewood, California. Vivian Dubois had just wrapped up a long day at the office. The weight of back-to-back meetings and high-pressure decisions still lingered in her mind as she drove through the empty streets, hoping to make it home in time to unwind. She didn't anticipate that a routine drive home would turn into a nightmare. Turning onto a side street, she made a cautious roll through a four-way stop sign, not realizing that the subtle mistake would be the catalyst for a life-altering encounter. She was just about to drive past when the unmistakable red and blue lights flashed behind her, followed by the sharp sound of a siren. With a sigh, Vivian pulled over, gathering her thoughts and preparing herself for the usual traffic stop. She knew the drill, having been through it many times before, but little did she know that this time, things would take a darker turn. Officer Ken Riley, a man in his early 40s, approached her vehicle with a sense of entitlement that was immediately apparent. His steps were heavy, his gaze cold and condescending. He barely offered a greeting, immediately accusing her of not fully stopping at the sign, despite the fact that she had. His tone, unreasonably harsh for such a minor infraction, struck Vivian like a slap in the face. But she remained composed, responding calmly, trying to explain the situation and keep things professional. However, Riley was not interested in reason. His eyes narrowed as he studied her, scanning her appearance and making assumptions based on nothing more than her skin color. He began to ask questions about her car, her clothes, even her presence in that neighborhood. Questions laced with a biting racism that Vivian could feel weighing heavily on her. This transition from the calm of Vivian's day to the aggressive nature of the encounter creates a strong emotional shift and sets the stage for the growing tension that follows. It emphasizes Vivian's composure and resilience in the face of unfair treatment, making it clear that something much larger was at play. Vivian's patience was beginning to wear thin as Officer Riley's rude tone persisted. She had expected some scrutiny, but the level of disrespect she was receiving caught her off guard. He continued to accuse her, his words growing increasingly condescending. His questions were no longer about the stop. He had shifted to personal attacks, making snide comments about her appearance, her car, and even the neighborhood she was in. It was clear that this wasn't about the traffic violation anymore. It was about him asserting control over her. "Is this your neighborhood, ma'am?" he sneered, his eyes scanning her modest vehicle in her plain business attire, as if to imply she didn't belong there. Vivian's calmness only seemed to irritate him further. She knew how to navigate these situations, but the anger simmering beneath the surface was hard to contain. She had dealt with systemic racism in her career, but this was different. She was being harassed, degraded, and treated like a criminal simply because of who she was. "Officer, this behavior is completely unacceptable," Vivian said firmly, her voice steady but laced with warning. "You have no right to make assumptions about me based on my race, and I ask that you treat me with the same respect you would anyone else." But Riley wasn't done. His eyes narrowed and his jaw clenched as he leaned in closer, refusing to back down. He was accustomed to having the upper hand, and Vivian's request for his name and badge number struck him as a challenge to his authority. His reaction was immediate. "You don't need my name," he snapped, his voice rising. "I'm the law here." Vivian's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but she didn't raise her voice. Instead, she took a deep breath, fully aware that this interaction could escalate further. And escalate it did. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with hostility as Officer Riley leaned in closer, his breath heavy with disdain. Vivian could feel the heat radiating from him, his rage simmering just beneath the surface. The moment she had requested his name, something inside him snapped. It was as though she had crossed an invisible line, challenging the authority he believed he had every right to wield. The sheer audacity of a black woman questioning him was something Riley couldn't tolerate. His authority was sacred, or so he thought. "Are you trying to sue me, ma'am?" he barked, his voice dripping with sarcasm and malice. "What do you think? You can just make demands like that?" His eyes flashed with a mix of disbelief and anger. Vivian, steady as ever, kept her gaze fixed on him. She wasn't about to let him throw her off course, no matter how much he provoked her. "Officer, I'm asking for your name and badge number because I am entitled to know. Your behavior is unprofessional and, frankly, unacceptable." Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a quiet strength that even she couldn't ignore. She had faced challenges in her life, but never had she been forced to contend with such blatant disrespect. Riley, however, was growing increasingly agitated, his fists clenched, his eyes narrowing. "Stop talking," he roared, his face inches from hers. Vivian could feel the heat of his breath against her skin, the intensity of his presence pushing her patience to the brink. Her mind raced. She knew the situation was escalating, fast, and it was quickly slipping out of her control. And then, in a moment of blind rage, it happened. Officer Riley's hand shot out like lightning, striking Vivian across the face. The slap echoed in the stillness of the night, a loud, sharp sound that seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. Vivian's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. The sting spread across her cheek, but it wasn't the physical pain that shook her. It was the sheer injustice of it all. The man who was supposed to serve and protect had just assaulted her, and for no reason other than his own prejudice and unchecked rage. The world seemed to slow as she processed what had just happened. Vivian's body went cold, and for a moment she was stunned. She couldn't believe what had just occurred, but the shock soon gave way to something much stronger: anger. The injustice of being assaulted by someone sworn to protect was a feeling she had never known, and it left a bitter taste in her mouth. Her face burned not just from the slap, but from the reality of the situation. For a brief second, Riley seemed to register the enormity of his actions. His eyes widened as he looked at her, and for just a flicker of a moment, there was fear. Genuine fear. But it was fleeting, replaced quickly by a desperate need to cover his tracks. "See? See what you made me do?" Riley shouted, turning the situation on its head. "You attacked me! You resisted arrest!" His voice was high-pitched with panic as he frantically tried to justify his actions. Vivian could see his mind working, trying to fabricate a story to explain his behavior. His own guilt was too much for him to bear, so he deflected, casting himself as the victim of an imagined attack. But Vivian was having none of it. She remained silent, her gaze unwavering as she took in the absurdity of the scene unfolding in front of her. This man who had just slapped her and falsely accused her was now trying to paint himself as the one under threat. It was a familiar story, one that black individuals across the country had experienced time and time again. The victim was blamed, the perpetrator exonerated. Vivian's resolve hardened. She wasn't going to let Riley get away with this. She wasn't just fighting for herself now. She was fighting for every person who had been falsely accused, every person who had been silenced by the very system meant to protect them. "You're under arrest," Riley declared, his voice trembling with a mix of self-righteousness and fear. He yanked open the car door and roughly grabbed her arm. Vivian didn't fight back physically. She knew better than to give him any excuse to escalate things further. But inside she seethed. Her body shook not from fear, but from the anger coursing through her veins. She had been attacked, insulted, and falsely accused, but she wasn't going to allow herself to be humiliated any further. With brutal force, Riley twisted her arm behind her back and slapped the cold, sharp handcuffs onto her wrists. The metal bit into her skin, but it was the humiliation of the entire situation that hurt the most. He shoved her toward the patrol car with all the force of someone trying to assert control over a helpless victim. Vivian stumbled slightly but regained her footing. She didn't let him see how much this hurt. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. The door of the patrol car slammed shut, and Vivian was thrust into the cramped back seat. She sat there, her mind racing, still processing everything that had just happened. She could hear Riley's gloating voice as he relayed his fabricated version of the events over the radio, painting himself as the hero and her as the criminal. But Vivian knew the truth, and she wasn't going to let this go. Not now. Not ever. The car ride to the station was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle from Officer Riley's radio. Vivian sat stiffly in the back of the patrol car, her mind racing as she replayed the events in her head. She had been through difficult situations before, but this one was different. This time, the injustice was too blatant to ignore, and the humiliation of being assaulted by someone who was supposed to protect her weighed heavily on her. But Vivian wasn't just any woman. She wasn't going to be a victim in this story. She had seen enough to know how this would play out if she let it go unchecked. Another black woman silenced, another officer protected. This was her fight now, and she was going to make sure the system faced the consequences of its failures. When they arrived at the station, Riley seemed almost satisfied with himself. He still wore that smug, gloating expression as he led Vivian into the check-in area. His arrogance was palpable. His belief that he had done nothing wrong, nothing that could threaten him or his career, was evident in every step he took. He handed over her personal belongings to Officer Peterson, the officer on duty, and reported her offenses with a sense of pride, as if this was just another routine arrest to him. But something was different this time. Vivian wasn't just any other person being processed at the station. She wasn't a nameless victim with no recourse. She had the knowledge, the authority, and the resources to fight back, and Riley was about to find out just how wrong he was. As Peterson began taking Vivian's basic information, name, age, address, Vivian's composure remained unshaken, but there was a subtle shift in the air. Officer Peterson, who had started the procedure with the usual detachment, seemed to notice something odd about the way Vivian carried herself. Even in handcuffs with the red mark of Riley's slap still visible on her face, Vivian remained calm, collected. It wasn't the response of someone who had been defeated. When Peterson asked about her occupation, Vivian raised her head, locking eyes with Riley, who was still watching her from across the room, his smirk fading. She responded, her voice clear and authoritative. "Supervisory Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words dropped into the room like a bombshell. A wave of silence followed as the gravity of what had just been revealed took hold. Riley's eyes went wide in disbelief. He had no idea who he had just assaulted. Vivian wasn't just any woman. She was a high-ranking federal agent, someone whose job it was to hold people like him accountable. "FBI," Riley stammered, his voice barely audible. The color drained from his face as the reality of his mistake hit him. His career, his freedom, everything he had worked for was about to crumble in an instant. Vivian could see the panic settling in on Riley's face, but she didn't react. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no gloating. She simply turned back to Peterson, who was now staring at her with a mix of respect and fear. He hadn't known who she was either, but he had been the first to see that something wasn't right. His eyes flicked to Riley, and for the first time he saw the officer's nervousness. Vivian didn't allow the moment to linger too long. She remained professional, composed, but firm. She didn't need to say much more. She had done what needed to be done. The truth had been revealed, and there was no turning back. "Please make the necessary call," Vivian said, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. Peterson nodded quickly, signaling another officer to report the situation to the station commander. It wasn't long before the local police chief and other senior officers arrived, their faces tense and unsure of what was about to unfold. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate, palpable. Vivian had triggered a response far beyond what anyone had anticipated, and the local police department was about to face a reckoning. As the days passed, Vivian Dubois' call to the FBI set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The police station in Baton Rouge was suddenly thrust into the spotlight, its walls now reverberating with the weight of what had transpired. What seemed like an isolated act of police brutality against one woman had quickly morphed into a national story, a symbol of systemic racism, abuse of power, and the need for accountability within law enforcement. Vivian sat quietly in the interrogation room with her colleagues, recounting everything that had happened, from the moment Officer Riley had initiated the traffic stop to the assault and illegal arrest that followed. She didn't embellish the story. There was no need to. The truth spoke for itself. The room was tense as the FBI leadership listened intently, their focus unwavering. They knew the severity of the situation. A high-ranking federal agent had been assaulted in the line of duty by a local police officer, and the evidence was damning. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Officer Riley's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. The deeper the FBI dug into his history, the more troubling his record became. His track record was riddled with complaints from minority citizens who had been subjected to his aggressive and discriminatory tactics. Time and time again, Riley had used excessive force, making baseless accusations and targeting people of color. Yet these complaints had been brushed aside by his superiors, his actions often dismissed with light reprimands or ignored entirely. The investigative team combed through Riley's past, pulling up reports of prior incidents where his conduct had crossed the line. They found a disturbing pattern. Riley's authority had been wielded with arrogance and a deep-seated prejudice. Each new piece of evidence confirmed what they had feared. A corrupt officer had been allowed to roam unchecked within the department for far too long. The abuse had festered beneath the surface, hidden by a system more inclined to protect its own than to hold its officers accountable. Vivian, a seasoned FBI agent, knew that this case wasn't just about her, it was about something bigger. As she watched the developments unfold, she felt a growing sense of responsibility, not only to see that justice was served, but to ensure that the system itself was held accountable. This wasn't just about seeking retribution for the assault she had endured. It was about sending a message to law enforcement across the country. Abuse of power would no longer be tolerated. At the same time, the public outcry grew louder. The moment Vivian's story hit the news, it sparked a wave of anger and support from all corners of society. Protesters flooded the streets of Baton Rouge, demanding that the police department take immediate action. Civil rights organizations rallied behind Vivian, their voices growing stronger as they pushed for justice not only for her, but for all those who had been wronged by officers like Riley. What had started as a personal battle quickly turned into a movement, one that called for sweeping changes within the police force. As the internal investigation into Officer Riley's conduct progressed, the pressure on the police department mounted. It wasn't just the city that was watching anymore. The nation was paying attention. News outlets covered the story extensively, and public trust in the police force began to erode. Even the police chief couldn't ignore the weight of the evidence. He had no choice but to take action. Riley was placed on indefinite leave, stripped of his weapon and badge. His career, which he had once believed was invincible, crumbled before his eyes. But the fallout didn't stop there. The FBI's Civil Rights Division took over the case, launching a federal investigation into the abuse of power and systemic racism that had plagued the Baton Rouge Police Department. The department's internal investigation revealed even more disturbing details about Riley's past. As it turned out, he wasn't the only officer with a history of abuse. The department had been covering up incidents of excessive force, racial profiling, and mistreatment for years. But now the truth was coming to light. With the FBI's involvement, it became clear that the entire department would have to answer for its failings. For Vivian, the victory wasn't in the punishment of one officer. It was in the larger change that this case had ignited. She had always known that systemic problems couldn't be solved with a single victory. But with this case, the foundation for real change had been laid. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope. A glimmer that change, real change, was possible. Riley was placed on indefinite leave, stripped of his weapon and badge. His career, which he had once believed was invincible, crumbled before his eyes. But the fallout didn't stop there. The FBI's Civil Rights Division took over the case, launching a federal investigation into the abuse of power and systemic racism that had plagued the Baton Rouge Police Department. The department's internal investigation revealed even more disturbing details about Riley's past. As it turned out, he wasn't the only officer with a history of abuse. The department had been covering up incidents of excessive force, racial profiling, and mistreatment for years. But now the truth was coming to light. With the FBI's involvement, it became clear that the entire department would have to answer for its failings. For Vivian, the victory wasn't in the punishment of one officer. It was in the larger change that this case had ignited. She had always known that systemic problems couldn't be solved with a single victory. But with this case, the foundation for real change had been laid. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope, a glimmer that change, real change, was possible. The days that followed the exposure of Officer Riley's misconduct were filled with chaos and consequences. The Baton Rouge Police Department was shaken to its core, and the city found itself at the center of a national conversation about systemic racism within law enforcement. But it wasn't just about one bad cop anymore. The entire department was under scrutiny, and for the first time, the public was demanding answers. Vivian's story, amplified by the media, spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of protests across the country. People took to the streets, not just in Baton Rouge, but in major cities from coast to coast, holding signs that read, "Justice for Vivian" and "End Police Brutality." Civil rights organizations, long calling for reforms within law enforcement, found themselves energized by the momentum of the case, rallying for changes that went far beyond just punishing one officer. They called for accountability, transparency, and for the laws meant to protect citizens to be applied equally to everyone, regardless of race or background. As the public outcry grew, the pressure on the Baton Rouge Police Department reached a breaking point. Protesters camped out in front of the police station, chanting for justice. The national spotlight on the department was impossible to ignore. With the FBI leading the investigation, there was nowhere to hide. The department's leaders could no longer sweep Riley's past under the rug, nor could they dismiss the mounting allegations of misconduct. Vivian, while still processing the events of the past few weeks, began to realize just how much larger this story had become. Her personal struggle was now symbolic of the fight for justice across the country. What had started as an isolated incident of police brutality had morphed into a full-blown movement, one that was calling for deep and systemic change. She sat in meetings with the FBI's leadership, as well as with civil rights leaders, strategizing the next steps. The investigation into Officer Riley was just the beginning. In these discussions, Vivian pushed for a comprehensive review of police practices nationwide, focusing on racism, abuse of power, and the lack of oversight within many police departments. She knew that true change wouldn't come from merely holding one officer accountable. It would require nationwide reform. As the investigation progressed, the Baton Rouge Police Department's dark history continued to come to light. Additional officers with similar complaints were identified, their actions often hidden behind closed doors. The department had long been plagued by a culture of silence and protection, with many officers turning a blind eye to misconduct for fear of retaliation or tarnishing their own careers. Vivian's case, however, had broken that wall, and as more whistleblowers stepped forward, the true depth of the problem began to unfold. One of the most striking revelations was how the department had routinely failed to hold officers accountable for previous incidents of excessive force, racial profiling, and even falsified reports. When these incidents were reported, they were often dismissed with minimal consequences or covered up entirely. It was a systematic failure, one that allowed officers like Riley to continue their abusive behavior unchecked. But now, with the weight of the federal investigation bearing down on them, the department had no choice but to face the truth. The calls for change were growing louder. The case wasn't just about Vivian anymore. It had become a platform for citizens, activists, and leaders to demand real change. The public wasn't satisfied with apologies or empty promises anymore. They wanted action. And as more people came forward with their own stories of police misconduct, the pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies to reform. The days that followed the exposure of Officer Riley's misconduct were filled with chaos and consequences. The Baton Rouge Police Department was shaken to its core, and the city found itself at the center of a national conversation about systemic racism within law enforcement. But it wasn't just about one bad cop anymore. The entire department was under scrutiny, and for the first time, the public was demanding answers. Vivian's story, amplified by the media, spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of protests across the country. People took to the streets, not just in Baton Rouge, but in major cities from coast to coast, holding signs that read, "Justice for Vivian" and "End Police Brutality." Civil rights organizations, long calling for reforms within law enforcement, found themselves energized by the momentum of the case, rallying for changes that went far beyond just punishing one officer. They called for accountability, transparency, and for the laws meant to protect citizens to be applied equally to everyone, regardless of race or background. As the public outcry grew, the pressure on the Baton Rouge Police Department reached a breaking point. Protesters camped out in front of the police station, chanting for justice. The national spotlight on the department was impossible to ignore. With the FBI leading the investigation, there was nowhere to hide. The department's leaders could no longer sweep Riley's past under the rug, nor could they dismiss the mounting allegations of misconduct. Vivian, while still processing the events of the past few weeks, began to realize just how much larger this story had become. Her personal struggle was now symbolic of the fight for justice across the country. What had started as an isolated incident of police brutality had morphed into a full-blown movement, one that was calling for deep and systemic change. She sat in meetings with the FBI's leadership, as well as with civil rights leaders, strategizing the next steps. The investigation into Officer Riley was just the beginning. In these discussions, Vivian pushed for a comprehensive review of police practices nationwide, focusing on racism, abuse of power, and the lack of oversight within many police departments. She knew that true change wouldn't come from merely holding one officer accountable. It would require nationwide reform. As the investigation progressed, the Baton Rouge Police Department's dark history continued to come to light. Additional officers with similar complaints were identified, their actions often hidden behind closed doors. The department had long been plagued by a culture of silence and protection, with many officers turning a blind eye to misconduct for fear of retaliation or tarnishing their own careers. Vivian's case, however, had broken that wall, and as more whistleblowers stepped forward, the true depth of the problem began to unfold. One of the most striking revelations was how the department had routinely failed to hold officers accountable for previous incidents of excessive force, racial profiling, and even falsified reports. When these incidents were reported, they were often dismissed with minimal consequences or covered up entirely. It was a systematic failure, one that allowed officers like Riley to continue their abusive behavior unchecked. But now, with the weight of the federal investigation bearing down on them, the department had no choice but to face the truth. The calls for change were growing louder. The case wasn't just about Vivian anymore. It had become a platform for citizens, activists, and leaders to demand real change. The public wasn't satisfied with apologies or empty promises anymore. They wanted action. And as more people came forward with their own stories of police misconduct, the pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies to reform. For Vivian, the investigation was a moment of reflection. She had always known that systemic issues like these couldn't be solved with a single victory, but seeing the evidence unfold in front of her eyes confirmed what she had feared for so long. The problems within the police force ran deeper than anyone had imagined, but she also knew that this was a turning point. This was the moment when things could begin to change. The investigation into Riley's actions wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about creating a foundation for reform, a foundation that would demand accountability and transparency from law enforcement agencies across the country. As the investigation progressed, Vivian's role in the case grew more significant. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a catalyst for change. Her bravery had sparked a movement, one that was demanding justice not only for her, but for every citizen who had been wronged by law enforcement. Civil rights groups, activists, and everyday citizens rallied behind her, pushing for reforms that would prevent incidents like hers from happening again. The public's demand for change was impossible to ignore, and the Baton Rouge Police Department, under immense pressure, could no longer turn a blind eye to the abuse of power that had festered within its ranks for so long. With each new revelation, the case gained more momentum. The local police chief, who had once been reluctant to act, was now forced to confront the truth. Riley had to be held accountable. The department's leadership, which had once failed to address the systemic issues within its own force, now had no choice but to take a hard look at the rot that had infected its core. Riley was placed on indefinite leave, and an internal investigation was launched into his entire career. The investigation was thorough and relentless. Every complaint, every report, every piece of evidence was examined with painstaking detail. It wasn't long before the full extent of Riley's actions was revealed. He had a history of targeting black individuals, using his badge to intimidate and abuse people of color. His actions were reprehensible, but they were also part of a much larger pattern of misconduct within the department. And now, with the FBI involved, the department could no longer sweep it under the rug. Vivian knew that the fight wasn't over. The investigation was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, obstacles from within the department, pushback from powerful figures who wanted to maintain the status quo. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out, and the wheels of justice were turning. Officer Riley's career was over, but the case had opened the door for a larger conversation about police reform and accountability. As the investigation reached its final stages, the public's support for Vivian only grew stronger. The demands for justice were louder than ever. People were ready for change. They wanted to see real reform, not just empty promises. And with the FBI's involvement, the case had become a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for too long. Vivian's bravery had sparked a movement, and the wheels of justice were finally turning in a direction that could lead to real, lasting change. As the dust began to settle, the fallout from Officer Riley's actions was far from over. His termination and the federal charges that followed were only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. What had initially seemed like a personal victory for Vivian Dubois had transformed into a public call for systemic change in law enforcement. The media continued to cover the case extensively, amplifying Vivian's story and shedding light on the wider issues of police brutality, racial discrimination, and the urgent need for reform. Vivian now more than ever understood that this wasn't just her fight. It had become a fight for every person who had been wronged by the system, every person who had felt the sting of unfair treatment simply because of the color of their skin. She had known that confronting her own trauma would be difficult, but as she watched the community rally around her, she realized that her strength was not just in her ability to survive, it was in her ability to spark a movement that demanded justice for all. The public pressure for reform grew louder by the day. Civil rights groups, community leaders, and even citizens who had never been directly affected by police misconduct were joining the conversation. They were calling for comprehensive police reform, accountability measures, transparent investigations, and more thorough training to address racial bias. People were no longer willing to turn a blind eye to the injustices that had been happening for decades. The movement that had begun with Vivian's bravery was spreading across the nation, with rallies, protests, and petitions calling for change. Meanwhile, within the Baton Rouge Police Department, the investigation into Riley's actions continued to uncover more troubling details. Not only had Riley been guilty of years of misconduct, but it also became clear that the department had failed to hold him, or others like him, accountable. The internal culture of silence and cover-ups was exposed, and with it came the realization that real, lasting reform needed to take place from the ground up. For Vivian, the victory wasn't in the punishment of one officer. It was in the shift that had taken place within the community, the country, and the justice system itself. Officer Riley's actions had been horrific, but they had opened the door to a broader conversation that could lead to real change. The investigation had forced the police department to confront its own flaws, and while there was still much work to be done, Vivian knew that this moment marked a significant step toward a more just society. The story of Vivian Dubois serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up against injustice, even when it seems like the odds are stacked against you. Vivian's courage in the face of blatant racism and abuse of power not only changed her life but sparked a nationwide movement for justice and police reform. The key lesson here is that one voice, even in a moment of adversity, can ignite the change that's desperately needed in society. It's important to remember that while we may face challenges, whether in the form of discrimination, unfair treatment, or systemic problems, it is through standing firm, speaking out, and seeking accountability that we can drive meaningful change. For older generations, this story can be a reminder that it's never too late to stand up for what is right. Whether in our families, communities, or the broader society, we all have a role to play in ensuring justice for all. The pursuit of fairness is a continuous effort, and the fight for what's right often starts with one courageous person, like Vivian, who refuses to let injustice go unnoticed. If you've experienced something similar, or if this story has resonated with you, I encourage you to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. Let's continue to support each other and ensure that we keep pushing for positive change. Your voice matters. Never underestimate the power of standing up for what is right.